We need sound. We need sound, please.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me now. Sorry about that. So there used to be daily aircraft carrier flights into the region, which would ship beef back to the coast to serve the British colonial hubs. That ended after the uprising, plus some foot and mouth outbreaks in Brazil. Today, the cattle industry mostly supplies a small regional market. It's very competitive and a very difficult life. Communities manage cattle mostly for themselves, to sell to within villages or between villages, sometimes to the regional capital, which is Lethem on the border with Brazil, or even limited sale across the border into Brazil. Today, this region has about 25,000 people that are spread across around 40 indigenous communities, indigenous Mapuche and Wapishan communities. There are still around 12 private ranches, which are on lands that are leased from the government. And livestock remains important economically in this region where there aren't a lot of other economic opportunities, but also culturally. The Rupununi Rodeo is one of the most important events of the year, happens on Easter weekend. And local vaqueros come and display their skills and sort of celebrate the ranching lifestyle, which is part of this long history. So with a region where human population density is relatively low, there's intact natural savanna, but also huge tracts of intact tropical forest. You also have healthy jaguar populations, and where those two mix, you have human-wildlife conflict. And so livestock in the region are mostly managed in a free-roaming style, so people may or may not have corrals. Vaqueros are usually not paid, so vaqueros are like cattlemen, people that would go and do roundups, organize the cows, prepare them for sale, and so on. Very often are not a paid position, and so are not intensively looking after cattle. Because you have big stretches of savanna, cows are mostly put out to graze on their own, and then when you need them, you go out looking for them, find them back. Sometimes jaguars find them first, sometimes other people find them first. There's a recurring joke about who is worse as far as predating on cows: two-footed jaguar, which is people, or four-footed jaguar, which is jaguar. So in this sort of large wilderness landscape, which is sparsely populated, there's always issues with cattle disappearing. This doesn't happen too frequently, but because cattle herds are small and alternative economic opportunities are not very common, the loss of even a single cow for an individual owner is high. So the retaliation for losing those cows can be harsh at times. So that's kind of the background. Oh, jaguars are also fully protected in Guyana. There are some exceptions written into the law for threats to personal safety and property, but those things are not super well understood broadly. So there's a lot of questions about conflict. What do you do? How do we promote cattle industry? How do we mix livelihoods and conservation? And that was sort of where this project came from. Most of the work that I had been doing historically have been focused on wildlife ecology and conservation specific things. First, trying to estimate jaguar populations with camera traps, then working on sort of game species and impact of hunting. Over time, we began getting some anecdotal evidence about conflict. So you see here 3 little piggies going to the market, and mama jaguar going to the same markets and returning with one of those 3 little piggies. And this was just happened after you have thousands and thousands of trap nights use, and do end up getting some cool stuff by chance. So this was a female jaguar. She fed a little while, she came back, and then she took her dinner to go. We had a colleague of mine who we work with on some projects was complaining about his sheep going missing. And so we opportunistically set up a camera to sort of not verify, but test out what he was saying. You get a lot of information here. He has sheep. He's got dogs that are guarding his sheep. He has a sheep pen, which is right here a little bit off camera, which is only about 20 feet from his house. And all of this is about 20 feet from one of the main roads in the region. He and his wife bring their sheep in every evening. And so looking at the situation, not that I was doubting him, but I felt like, oh, if, this is a jaguar situation, or is this one of those 2-foot jaguar situations? So we said, we'll verify with camera trap. And so this is a female jaguar that was trying to pull the sheet metal off of the side of this person's sheep pen to access the sheep inside. She's, I think, got scared by the sheet metal, so you can see she's walking away here. This is just, so they bring their sheep in at 6. This is at 7. So she hardly waited an hour for it to get dark, and then came back at 10. See, it looks like she has an injury to one of her eyes, which isn't shining, reflecting in here. And also, I think some indication that she may have been nursing because she's got some skin. So we find that just in anecdotal reports and come across a lot of evidence that it seems that we get a lot of young, inexperienced animals that tend to take livestock, a lot of old, injured, and sick animals that take livestock, and then also nursing individuals that are trying to meet the demands of feeding extra mouths, right? And if you think about it, chasing peccaries or agoutis through the forest or capybaras, right? It's dangerous, it's difficult, it's strenuous. And then you have a bunch of big, not very bright animals just standing out in the open. It's a wonder that these jaguars aren't preying on livestock more often. But so we verified this instance, and this sort of keyed me into this issue and thinking about how can we work together, leverage the work that we've been doing to try to address this issue that's really pervasive in the region, and think about it in a way that's a little bit unique, because human-wildlife conflict projects are very common. They're very common with jaguars in South America. And when you raise the idea of doing a new human-jaguar conflict project, particularly to other people that are working on big cats, they would say, oh, well, we solved this already, and here's our pamphlet on how you should do it. And I may not have known a lot about solving issues related to conflicts before we started this project, but I was sure that the people that we work with in this region don't respond to what they read on the pamphlet. And so our goal was to create a shared learning approach where we may be redoing some work that others have done in other areas, but the key part is that we're all doing it together, and that we're learning the lessons together, that we're gathering the information from this specific place and time, and then we can sort of reflect on that information and move forward together.
What gaps did you find in between what people said their needs were and what scientists said their needs were?
So that's a good question. I think one of the big issues here was because cattle are free roaming, a lot of people didn't have they knew a lot about their cows, but they didn't know where they were going all the time, how much time they spent in the forest, how much time they were going to drink, where they knew about a lot of where their resources were, but there were a lot of gaps about how these animals were spending their time and how maybe where they were going would put them in danger with jaguars. There were also a lot of questions here. So this has been, like I said, the history with cattle in this region is short, especially with communities. But in that time, they developed a tradition that it's this kind of Wild West, open landscape. Cows take care of themselves, then we jump on our horses and we ride off into the sunset looking for them. And it's this very, lassoing animals in the savannah and jumping on top of them, this, real sort of Wild West thing. And a lot of people take pride in it, and they enjoy that sort of bravado of being involved with cattle industry. So when you're handed some information that says, well, the best thing to do is to lock your cows up in a corral and, plant grass and dig a well and do, some sort of more intensive livestock management, people feel like, unless I see it, I'm not convinced to give up this thing that I enjoy about it,
Especially in like the contributing factor to masculinity and femininity.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think those are some of the key things that we've been trying to approach and try to address through this process, where First thing was some research to try to understand the problem and fill some of those gaps, and understand what the gaps were first, and then try to start filling them. Then work together to identify solutions. Step 3, which is going to be happen during this year, is going to be implement and model some of those solutions, and then monitor and adapt as we go. So one of the first things that we did were these conflict mapping workshops. So I should say that I've been very involved in the design of this project and the training, but the project has been carried out exclusively by local field teams. And we brought together a group as this project was starting and sort of identified that that was going to be a key aspect of this project, because I've been working on jaguars for a long time, and just because I've been doing that kind of work, I'm not from there, I'm an outsider, right? The perception is that my priority is on jaguar protection exclusively, regardless of whether what people are doing, how they're benefiting or how they're being affected. So we decided early on that it would be important that this face was not involved in any of this work, but that I was behind the scenes supporting local teams in implementing these projects. So the conflict mapping workshops that we did, we carried out across 9 communities and 6 private ranches. And we had a few key activities: ranking species involved in conflicts, doing community mapping of the distribution of resources and conflict itself, and then identifying and ranking key issues facing livestock producers. We had a full all-female research team that were leading these workshops, and they did an amazing job in both the implementation and the reporting. So as far as issues go, there was a whole suite of technical and capacity building issues that were involved, but one of the important things that we saw right away is that we were on the right track by working on this issue, because we see that predation on livestock by carnivores is number 2 issue, and it's only second to cattle rustling, which is people stealing livestock from one another, right? And cattle rustling is a business in the Rupununi, and there are generations of cattle rustlers that have trained the next generation and so on. It's a family tradition for some folks, and it's sort of part of the business, but something that is always an issue that is pervasive. So we'll be doing some work with our in-country partners to try to address some of these things, but we continue our focus here. We sought to understand which livestock species were most vulnerable, right? So we didn't want to fall into the trap of only focusing on jaguars and cows if that wasn't the most important issue. So we tried to take a broader approach. We created these cards for livestock and carnivore species to help people make sure that everybody's thinking about and talking about the same species, creating a visual guide so that people that aren't reading and writing or aren't as strong in reading or writing could also know what's going on. We used local indigenous languages as well to help to make sure that everybody felt like they could participate and there weren't any barriers to being involved. So I'm going to show this chart with all of the sites, and I won't show another one that's like this, but just so that everyone can kind of see what they're looking at. We scored these ranking activities across sites, and then what I'll be showing you from now on is just sort of an average across all of these locations. We had 12 workshop sites, and some of them were a private ranch and a community that were combined in one workshop just for logistical reasons, but they were kept separate in terms of the data. So again, we were on the right track. Cattle are the #1 most important species in terms of being predated by wild carnivores. One of the things that caught us not off guard, but was a little surprising, was that chicken was the second most important. And so I'm going to follow back up on that idea a little bit later, but just noting that we were sort of learning as we were going that predation of chicken was very important. And specifically, it was important, especially for female participants in our workshops. So keeping livestock that was small livestock that were more close to the house. In these indigenous communities, there's a clear division of labor between genders. Men tend to be focusing on the cattle farther away from the house, whereas women would focus more on chickens, sheep, ducks, guinea fowl, dogs, and cats that are sort of closer to the household. And this has been the sort of traditional division of labor for generations in these communities, and it continues to persist today. So we repeated this process for carnivores, the same cards to help people make sure that they were identifying the correct species. As you can see here, so everybody sort of ranked the cards in order for the livestock and then did the same for the carnivores and then drew arrows to indicate who's eating who, basically, and use different colors to identify the stronger relationships. So red were the strongest, yellow were the weakest, and we're planning eventually to do sort of community analyses of these interactions between species somewhere further down the road, but this is more of sort of the applied part of this. So the worst offenders that we found in this workshop, human, number one, worst offender. And the funny part is that this was only a little bit lower because there was one community that ranked humans as 0. And this community is known as the rustling community. And so when I told that to ranchers, they said, of course, that's not an issue for them because they're the ones that are benefiting. So anyways, humans were by far the worst offender. You see jaguars and pumas, which are the 2 species in the region that are capable of taking down cattle. And then you see a whole suite of medium and small carnivores, birds of prey, snakes, lizards, small cats, owls, right, possums even, that are mostly predating on chickens. So again, this sort of reinforced that this issue with chickens is important to people. And it's much more complicated because there's a whole suite of species that are involved. So also during these workshops, we did community mapping, where we asked people to indicate points of interest on a sort of large printed out Google Earth or satellite imagery that had reference points already, but people identified ports of interest, important resources for cattle like grazing grounds, where they go to get supplemental minerals, where they go to drink water, any livestock management structures like fences. You can see like this are fences in this map down here. There are corrals. This is a corral here at Saddle Mountain Ranch. And then also where depredation events, so where wild carnivores were killing livestock over the previous 2-year period. So the literature indicates that after 2 years, the memory starts to get a little fuzzier. So we asked people to think about when these events occurred and where over the previous 2 years. And then the same for retaliatory events. So where people retaliated by killing or trying to kill some species of carnivore. And we found in terms of depredation events across all of the sites, cattle were the most often noted. I feel that, and our local facilitators felt as well, that because the workshop was, despite our best efforts, sort of focused on jaguars and cows, that people often focused on reporting those things and probably underreported the amount of chickens, because a lot of people said that this kind of thing can happen every day almost. So it would be exhausting to put all the points down on the map, and instead focused on these big, important, memorable events like cows. But you can see here that these things are fairly common across space. There was a lot of variation in pigs because not all communities keep pigs. And then it was relatively uniform, hit or miss across other communities. This was a big sort of not surprise, but this number jumped out for me when we mapped the retaliatory events. And this was something that for me has been elusive. I've been asking people about for as long as I've been going to the region. Nobody wants to talk about killing animals in retaliation for killing their livestock. And this is a fairly high number in a 2-year period for only 12 sites. So if you extrapolate that across sites, right, the numbers go up even farther for the whole region. And we noted that the majority of these villages that had NAs said that they tried unsuccessfully, right? So it wasn't for lack of trying or for some conservation desire. It was that they didn't get through, shot and missed, or they went out and the jaguar didn't come back, or whatever. Again, we saw there were a couple of communities that noted really high retaliation against hawks for chickens. And I don't think that these villages are unusual. I think that they just, maybe they had more women at their workshop, and so the information came across, or, you know, I don't know, by the end of the day, they weren't as tired as other groups or whatever. So they were willing to go into more detail, but we had some interesting information and some numbers that are somewhat troubling. So Our next step, after we sort of gathered all this information, talked it over, we identified one of the key gaps that was missing in the data that people wanted to know was more about where their cows were going when they couldn't see them. So we purchased GPS collars from a company called Lone Star Tracking. We deployed the collars on 30 cows at the same 9 villages and 6 ranches. The collars were applied by various methodologies. Only 2 of the sites had chutes. So these are chutes, right? A compression chute that made it easy to put the collars on. Others have this kind of Wild West style where you have to rope the cow and put it down and then put the collar on as fast as you can and let it go. These ranches are doing this relatively regularly to vaccinate when they can. Some ranches use ear tags, identify and survey individuals and so on, but all of our methods were approved by IAPC, even if some of this doesn't look 100% nice, but it was highly variable. So this was a massive Brahma bull named Santa, and we were able to just walk up and put the collar on while Santa was laying down. And Bakiri, who was in charge of him, was just petting him and saying, "Good boy, Santa. It's okay, Santa." And then others, it was like, you know, this bull was like snarling mad and spitting snot, and every time you got close was trying to catch you with the horn. So it was a whole variety and a big learning process. Some of the challenges that we experienced, so these collars were set to upload data through cellular signal. Some sites that worked really well, other sites it didn't work at all. The backup is that the data would be stored on board, so then you have to recover the collar. Challenge there was that some of these cows people couldn't find again, or they couldn't find again for months. And this is their normal approach. They would go out riding and looking around. Sometimes you find, sometimes you don't find, sometimes you find one group, sometimes you find another. So it was difficult. We're still getting collars coming in, and we started trying to recover them probably 8 or 9 months ago. Some of them have fallen off. Some of them, when they were on big bulls, they started sparring during the breeding season. I think they probably snagged the strap and tore them off. You can see here, here's a collared bull after it came back in. Here's a bull that we collared, so you can see his ear tag, but collar's gone. So we did lose some data. We learned some lessons. Our research group hasn't done this type of research before, so it was a learning process for everybody involved, including myself. Trying to not be an old dog that's not learning anything new once they go over to the faculty side. So this was a good challenge, but we did have a fair amount of data that came back from, so this was one of the sites that had regular cellular uploads. And this is a truly free roaming cattle site. And you can see the corral where we collared the animals is right here. And you can see that some of these animals in the blue and the red, this was in one single day. They moved about 7 kilometers from the corral as soon as they were let out, and then went back to their place where they normally hang out over here. We're finding that these free roaming animals spend a lot more time in the forest. They do not go back to the corrals, or they're not near any sort of human habitation very frequently. So they're sort of semi-wild. In this region, they call them matir, which is, I think is actually Portuguese for wild cow or something like that. But anyways, we see that these ones are much more free roaming. They're spending more time in the danger zone as far as jaguars go, compared to animals that are brought back to their corrals regularly. You see that their points really cluster around these corral locations. These are 3 different communities. We collared 1 animal in each site at their corral. Sometimes, you know, Bakira falls asleep, he forgets to go out or whatever, and the animals get a little farther away, but eventually they bring them back in. And so these animals avoided forested areas more. They spent more time in the corrals near to the village. And I think that we think that this has a clear benefit for staying away from large carnivores where they would be in danger. Some of the other high conflict zones that we identified during the mapping exercise were in seasonal water sources during the dry season. So this region, the savanna, during the height of the dry season, it's almost like desert. It's hard to find water. It's very dry, very sandy soil. During the rainy season, the rivers come up, expand, overflow their banks, and those same areas that were almost like desert are totally underwater and are in these seasonal wetlands. And so during that dry part of the year where water is scarce, right? Those natural water sources, springs, creeks that keep water, deep holes where a puddle would stay, become important for livestock and for wildlife. So we decided to camera trap these sites specifically. And as you would guess, we had some visitors that were frequenting these sites. This was at Saddle Mountain Ranch, I believe, a large male jaguar. This is another private ranch called Point Ranch. There was a spring just off camera here. And this male was frequently walking by this camera, which was kind of interesting. I was trying to figure out the best way to condense sort of a whole sequence of photos, but I think the really interesting, usually I would avoid using pie chart, but I think that the most interesting thing about this camera trapping was that the frequency with which we were documenting jaguars was high. It was comparable to what we've seen in forested protected areas in Guyana, as well as all across the savannas. But the interesting thing about these sites is that this proportion of all of the photos is only livestock. So the videos in this case of natural prey or native prey were very infrequent and very low. And so jaguars were selecting these areas specifically with the frequency which was close to sort of what we would expect for a forested protected area, in areas where there's almost no natural or native prey, right? And so it doesn't take too much of a stretch for you to think what's, other than the water, what's attracting them there, right? These same large, meaty animals that stand out in the open and are fairly easy to prey on. And so that's another sort of suggestion for thing to think about for us is how do you manage water, particularly in dry season and these sites, and how do you try to keep livestock and large carnivores separate. And then the jaguar management issue with then how do you replace this prey is a whole other thing for another day, but an interesting part. So another part of this project was a master's student who is advised by Dr. Jessica Kaler, but who I've known for a long time, has been working to understand from a sociological perspective the response, the retaliatory response. What makes people, some people respond every time a cow is killed, they want to go out and kill it. Some people, they can lose 100 cows and they're like, nah, it's just part of living on this landscape. And then sometimes it changes from individual to individual by the day. Sometimes you're having a bad day and you want to take it out on something, right? Sort of human nature. But his project, his master's project has been to try to understand what's going on with these retaliatory events. And I'll let him tell it.
Here.
He's in Guyana right now, so he's appearing by video.
Just as this is an issue discussion, in Guyana, human-carnivore conflicts serve the job. There have been reported attacks on humans, livestock losses, as well as retaliation for their jobs. This has led to the conflicts being considered a priority not only for national wildlife development, but for community-based wildlife development, especially in rural areas, which is where the study is located. Human-jaguar conflict that runs throughout Guyana is understudied, which further complicates management. My aim is to understand human dimensions, specifically referring to the socio-cultural aspects of these issues. I'm interested in the motivations and factors contributing to undesirable behavior towards jaguars, as well as understanding community members' role in preventing these undesirable behaviors from occurring. To this, I conducted 7 structured interviews across the region concerned specifically with tolerance, which is this willingness to live alongside jaguars, guardianship intention, willingness to guard against harm to those jaguars, and environmental stewardship, and the pro-environmental actions and behaviors, among other areas. 148 surveys led to frequencies that represented the cultural and linguistic diversity of the community. We found a dominant belief that jaguar population had increased in the past 10 years. Interestingly enough, tolerance is normally distributed, with the vast majority of participants favoring the jaguar populations remain the same increase. Nevertheless, participants were moderately worried about the use of jaguars, with 30% personally noticing the attacks. Across the study, we found diverse attitudes and beliefs about jaguars. Participants reported overall low perceived ability to control risks to jaguars, yet viewing jaguar management as a priority and concern, with a high ability to participate in decision-making about jaguar management. Past experiences with jaguars, as opposed to tolerance, statistically affected participants' willingness to intervene in the case of crime against jaguars. And across multiple modes, age and gender were significant in the interaction term and as individual statistical effects. Indicate the human conflict is an emerging conservation risk. That management may need gender and age specific interventions. Further investigations will look at the factors of effect tolerance, attitudes and beliefs about the benefits and risks from jaguars, risks to jaguars from humans, as well as environmental structure. Thank you.
So I think some of the really interesting things that have come out of Meshach's work so far is that human-jaguar conflict is something that's very concerning, but the concern varies among gender and age groups, which makes things more complicated when you're thinking about addressing the issue, but it's good to know. And that I think people's perceived ability to affect the issue is very low, right? So tells us that people feel a little bit helpless. Like, jaguars are here, they're taking your cows, there's nothing really I can do. The only thing that I could really do is pick a gun and maybe kill a jaguar. Maybe that'll ease the issue for a little while. And so this background information is really interesting and important for addressing our actions moving forward. At the same time, because this small livestock issue has really sort of risen to the top. Yes,
Right? I'm wondering, are the humans that are targeting these jaguars, is it the jaguar, or are they at random jaguars?
So that's an interesting question, and I think that what people typically do, and what we heard in these interviews, is that for a lot of species, you only find the aftermath, right? You find a carcass or animals are missing or whatever, and by the time you find it, it's gone. Especially like with small livestock, owl flies in, takes a chicken, it's long gone, nothing you can do. Jaguars, when they kill a cow, they return to the carcass to feed until the carcass is gone. And so when people find a fresh carcass, they know that this is an opportunity to catch an animal in the act when they come back to feed. So they would set a blind, usually up in a tree, and wait for the animal to return to feed, and then shoot the animal once it returns. Jaguars are known to scavenge. They're also known to steal carcasses that have been killed by pumas. There's a whole sort of interaction that's starting to emerge from the literature, and I'm sure that the responsible party is not always the one that ends up getting shot. Somebody probably finds this carcass and thinks, oh, I just come here and feed, and then next thing you know, they get punished for something that they didn't do. But yeah, I think that's part of it's impossible for people to really know, because again, they're just out riding looking for cows, and they find a fresh kill and think, okay, I'm going to stay here and wait. Yeah. So because of the importance of this small livestock dimension, Ms. Sarina Kawall, who's a master's student in NDP, has included a project that focuses more specifically on this so that we can address the issues of those stakeholders as well. So I'm going to invite Sarina to tell you a little bit about what she's been doing too.
All right, hello everyone. So maybe not all of you know that I am from Guyana. So I went home to do my MPP field research. This is how you get about in your community. TCD, we did not have access to pickup, so that was me. So why did I specifically focus on small carnivores and small livestock? So that's my advisor, and I knew that I wanted to do my project around human-wildlife conflicts. I just wasn't sure exactly what. But then he had these conflict mapping workshops, and the findings that he was getting is that conflict with large carnivores such as jaguars or pumas may not be as prevalent as people just assume it's like the main source. So I look at it as I went on a fact-finding mission to find out, well, is conflict with small carnivores and small livestock happening? And people think it's a problem, essentially. Also, please admire my beautiful picture. This is Shulanav village in their community. So how did I do it? So I used computer-assisted personal interviewing. So it's just, I used tablets and a person to do interviews. So myself and local researchers in 4 communities, Shulanav, Yupikari, Napi, and Aishalton, went house to house conducting surveys. So this is the team in Yupikari. We try to focus on hiring mainly women. So that's why we see 3 lovely ladies here. And I don't have my results yet. I'm looking at seeing my data, so just sharing some, I guess, impressions of the data. So the small livestock people rear the most in the European chickens. So 62% of respondents had chickens, and some had pigs, ducks, and sheep. So the survey is just focused on chickens, pigs, ducks, and sheep, which I think is probably unusual because people there are more used to having cows be the animal that's asked about. In some of my interviews, people were like, oh, but we have cows. And I'm like, okay, that's great, but I want to hear about your chickens. Right, so we use these, the conflict cards that Matt developed for use in the conflict mapping workshops, which were a big hit. I'm here sorting them because they were not inquired from where they had been stored. People really, really love these cards, by the way. I think especially the fact that the name was also in Creole, which you wouldn't find a lot because people tend to be like Creole, and also in Mapuche. So within the survey, we asked respondents, well, what animals do you have, which were attacked, and which carnivore attacked it. So for them to identify which carnivore attacked their livestock, they were just given this set of 36 cards of common carnivores in their community, and they went through it. And each time they would find a picture that corresponded with the animal they thought attacked it, they would give it back to the interviewer. They would submit it from the list. So, of course, the first question was, have you ever experienced an attack on your livestock? So 73% of respondents had experienced an attack. And of those respondents, 59% had experienced an attack within the last 12 months. Chickens were the most commonly attacked livestock species. So 23% of respondents experienced daily attacks, 21% experienced an attack every week, and 22% experienced an attack a couple times every month. So that's just a little over 60%, which is a lot of attacks, right? So I just did like the top 6 carnivores. So this is from Matt's workshop, the top 6 carnivores involved in conflict for jaguar, human, et cetera. And my surveys, these were the top 6. So you see the common one, human, with the jaguar, and vampire bat. But the main actors were birds of prey. And just to end, what people are doing to manage their livestock at the moment is they're using pens. So this is an example of a pen. You can't really see, but this is some chain link, and they have multiple animals there. I'm not sure if that just presents an opportunity for jaguars to come and have their pick, but anyway, so I don't have any other findings of yet, but please come to my research presentation next year, and I'll have those results.
So I think that the work that Sarina and Meshach are doing is, I forgot to mention that Meshach is also a Guyanese master's here, so he was also going home to do his master's work. Both of them are supported by assistantships from TCD, so proud to see both of them contributing to this project. So all of this data has sort of been culminating over the last, well, 2 years, because we started during the COVID year, which set back a lot of this interview, and so we couldn't bring people together the way that we wanted to. So we had to push some things back. move on. We culminated in a workshop that we held in May in the community. We're still doing a lot of this sort of academic analysis for publications of all this data, but that stuff is not important for this workshop. What we needed from the data, we could get from looking at it, compiling it in sort of more basic graphs and tables and presenting it to our partners from the project. So these are livestock folks, mostly cattlemen and a few cattle women, which is always great to see. From villages and ranches, we came together at Minari Ranch, which is centrally located, and with the goal of identifying some key strategies which we could implement in real life over the coming year. So the first thing that we did was present all of, so what I just have done for you, we did the same thing for all of the people who we've been working with over the past year, because they were the ones that were helping us throw down these cows and tie them up and put on the collars and set the camera traps and participate in the workshops and give all this information. So we compiled it all, presented it back to these stakeholders so that they could see how their site differs from others. The other thing that we found that people really liked about this workshop is that people in livestock producers don't get a chance to come together and talk to each other very often, because all these communities are very far apart. Transportation is difficult. Roads are not very good. And so the Root Community Rodeo is the one place where people come together, but livestock producers are super busy supplying animals for the events. And then the rodeo is always also a big party. So it's not a place to talk shop. So this was a really good opportunity for people to just chat about what is it to be a good livestock producer, what are the issues, what are the solutions, what are you doing? And then also to get all of this data presented back. Here's what we saw from the GPS collars, here's what we see from camera traps, so on and so forth. And then we led participants through a number of activities to help them contribute ideas for how these issues that could be addressed. So we actually did, in this workshop, we did cattle rustling and livestock conflict side by side, because we saw that what I see building in the data is that you've got all these issues facing livestock producers, right? People are losing chickens every day. People are losing cows to jaguars. People are stealing cows from you. And it's just a sort of broad annoyance to what for most people is like their savings, right? So people buy cows and it's like their savings account that's walking around the savannah. You go and harvest it when you need the cash in hand. If it's gone when you need cash, it's obviously an irritation. So we asked people to sort of think about what are the things you can do to address rustling. We've taken those suggestions to our local partners, local police, law enforcement, because that's more of their kind of issue, a theft issue, village leadership and so on. And then this wildlife part is something that we can work together to address. Participants identified, I was there at this workshop helping to present, but the leads for each project were really leading these activities and not telling people this is what you should do, or we're unbiased facilitators, just setting up the activities. People identified a broad suite of really suggestions for identifying livestock management, right? More frequent herding, building corrals, motion censored lights, artificial water sources, mineral sites, because we're finding that cows are really roaming far because they can't get what they need close to home, right? They need water. The soil and the grass, these are C4 grasses, are really nutrient poor. Soils, also old tropical soils are nutrient poor, so cows have to go and eat clay. They browse to, during certain times of the year to supplement their diet. And so if we can think about how to get mineral salts, mineral supplements, supplemental feed, these types of things to the region, which are available just across the border in Brazil, so you don't have to go too far to get most of these things. It might help to keep cows closer to home, more centrally located, and keep them from roving into places where they get into danger. We talked about the potential, they talked about the potential of fencing off, particularly water sources, to keep cows away from water sources, which are places that we know that jaguars frequent. They talked about training for vaqueros, so for the cattlemen, they've got a lot of young people that maybe haven't been in the industry for a long time, so that might be an important thing. We're going to try to put together a conflict database and reporting system so that when these events occur, people can document them with it. Everybody's got a smartphone, even though this is a remote region. can document and send data. We can compile it. Of course, there's suggestion for compensation programs, which we could do a whole nother presentation on, sort of global issues with carnivore compensation programs. But at least if we have the information, right, then this is more of a government or NGO thing. They have the baseline for that, and then some ideas for further research. So all of this work was supported by the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program up here in the corner, which is an EU-funded initiative, which is taking place across 12 tropical countries. Guyana is the only one in South America. And the implementing agency in Guyana is CIFOR, Center for International Forestry Research. And so when we proposed this project, we had a data collection phase, which we've now finished, and then an implementation phase. So what we're doing right now is basically pricing all of these options, figuring out how do we get these things, how do we get them to the region, how much does it cost, and how many of those 9 villages and 6 ranches can we implement these things at, right? Like digging a well is about $1 million Guyana dollar, which is about 25,000 US dollar job in the region. So we're not gonna be able to do that at every site. But motion sensor lights, those could be $20. So we probably could do that for everybody. So we're in the process of vetting the list of suggestions and then going back to our partners in country and saying, okay, here's the pricing, here's what we could do. How do we divvy this up between everybody so everyone gets something? And then how do we, of course, develop and implement a monitoring system so that we can see when we're doing these things, are predations going down, are retaliations going down, are they going up as a result? Is this doing nothing? And then we can continue to adapt that over time. So, will this process stop jaguars from ever eating a cow again? No, it's going to continue to happen. It's a big region, and these are wild animals that don't know. They're supposed to stay in their place, and people are supposed to stay in their place. But I hope that by engaging with livestock producers in trying to learn together and work together to solve a problem, that we've created a process that will make people feel like they're part of something, make people feel like they increase that perceived ability to intervene and solve these issues on their own. We heard from a lot of people that they want somebody from outside, Jacksonville Zoo or somebody, to come take these bad jaguars away and take them to the zoo somewhere or something like that. And those solutions are not feasible, right? There aren't enough zoo exhibits for every bad jaguar that's out there. So learning to live together is the key, and it's going to be challenging no matter what. But if there are ways that we can make people feel like they're being heard, their issues are being addressed, they're getting a little bit of something, we can help to address some of the other issues like access to veterinary medicine and access to the issues with cattle rustling. Maybe it makes the industry a little bit better, a little bit more profitable, makes losing a cow to a jaguar a little bit less hurtful every time that it happens. And so this is something that we're committed to working on for however long it takes. Even when the swim project is finished, we're committed to continuing this work and seeing how we can affect things in the long term. And so that's it. Thanks to, as I said, our funders, our in-country partner is the Guyana Wildlife Commission. And they're the ones that get the most complaints about these bad jaguars. So anything that we can learn and help address these issues makes their job easier as well. And as I said, our regional partner is the Rukuni Livestock Producers Association, which has been around since